Our first guest is a journalist, author, and storyteller whose two acclaimed books of narrative nonfiction about Mexico and Mexican immigration made him, according to the San Francisco Chronicle Book Review, the most original writer on Mexico and the border. Give a warm welcome to Sam Quinones. Sam is joined by the author of The Good Hand, a memoir of work, brotherhood, and transformation in American Boomtown, in which he details his life working the rigs during North Dakota's back-in oil boom. Welcome, Michael B. Smith.
So we're going to have a very, I guess, what you might call a very informal conversation, we've decided?
Yeah, I think so.
Great.
I think so.
Okay.
We'll keep it freewheeling.
Freewheeling. That's a great way to put it. So I'm Sam Quinones. I'm a journalist, as our friend just said. Wrote two books about the opioid epidemic. The latest one is called The Least of Us, and it's a book about synthetic drugs. Mike, why don't you just tell them a little bit about your
Yeah. So
your work.
I think I'm not going to use this. You guys can hear me pretty well. Recording and streaming. Okay. I will use it. I think I am going to use this. And my name's Michael Patrick Smith. The book I've written is called The Good Hand, and it's about I do not have much of a background in journalism. I was a playwright and struggling actor in New York, and I moved out to North Dakota to work on oil rigs and make much money as fast as I could. And while I was out there, I did quite a bit of writing, sending emails back to friends primarily. And through that, I ended up developing a book about my experience. So it took me about 7 years after I returned to stitch it together. And it came out last February on Viking Books.
So we are kind of we decided we were kind of like the book nonfiction vanguard of what's going on in nonfiction today is fascinating. What used to be in magazines is now in books, I think.
Right.
This kind of story you read, my Dreamland book could very well have been a book, but of course the downturn in a variety of other forms of journalism, and you're finding that books are kind of where that stuff migrates, I think, a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to tell you a little bit about the latest book that I've been working, that I've just published, is really about the drug trafficking world's move away from plant-based drugs, which is a huge move because it was really plant-based drugs are the foundation of the Mexican drug trafficking world. All the folks who started that, pioneers of that world, were all farmers. They were all ranchers in the 60s and 70s. And now their grandchildren are saying, why do we need land? Why do we need sunshine or seasons or poppies or, and they have moved into synthetic drugs. My book is really kind of about how that happened and that we are all now living with that. This is the new reality in drug use in America, is that very little of it is plant-based much anymore. And I suspect you will see more and more of it being non-plant, the chemical based. And what you're finding is now that we were talking about this a little bit ago. There was all this stuff in Dare and those movies that they'd show, the propaganda movies about drugs in the 30s. And so we used to laugh at that stuff. We were like, oh, that's not true. And we knew it wasn't true. We could tell it wasn't true. But now myth has become reality. You can die from a line of cocaine. You can die from a heroin will kill you and so on. It's a scary place to be as a country, as a culture, but that's kind of where we are right now. It's all connected again to what we created for ourselves with the opioid epidemic, which was Dreamland book, which is to say that we created by kind of delusional thinking in medicine that it was okay to prescribe narcotic painkillers to almost anybody for almost anything, no matter the background, no matter the person's issues, and that person would not somehow get addicted. And when we did that, we created an enormous, population of drug addicted consumers all across this country, and the underworld in Mexico kind of got wind of that and figured that out and understood it, and now they are running with it, and it's a scary thing, because all you need now, you don't need any land, you just need shipping ports, and the shipping ports are places where the chemicals can come from all over the world, and that's what's going on today, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really love about your writing, and what is sort of you get into kind of the very, very micro level of these sort of relationships with these low level dealers, but you also kind of bring it up to the higher forces, a little bit like the TV show The Wire, I want to say.
Right. Yeah.
And that's something that I've always been fascinated in. And, with my book, I feel like another thing we kind of share is sort of I don't know if a love of the underworld is the same, but sort of like having a love of people who live really close to the bone.
Right.
And having affection for people who are in these sort of intense situations.
Yeah, and I think to me, it's not so much a love of it. I get kind of worn out on it, but it is an endless fascination with, and also that it seems to me that I've spent a lot of time in my career in prisons, because there is where we were just talking about this with two of your folks here. When you get to the prison, frequently what you find is people who can tell all these stories that are very, very pertinent and relevant. Mm-hmm. I started doing it with street gangs in LA, but then moved on to other stuff. But it's once you get their stories, you can tell the authenticity, the power of it.
Yeah. I mean, something that I found was, because I moved to this town that had been a very small town. It was Williston, North Dakota. So you're kind of right on the corner of Earth in a certain way. You're very close to Canada, very close to Montana.
So that's where the world ends then.
Yeah, it feels like it's the edge.
Flat Earth. I thought it was a joke. I thought they were kidding.
And you had this tiny town. It had about 12,000 people in it in 2008. And within a few short years after these advances in technology had made the oil there recoverable, the town tripled, and some even say quintupled in size. So you had 40 to 50,000 men, primarily men, moved to this one tiny little place, and the mayhem that sort of ensues from that. But it's interesting because it immediately taxes the real estate market. Was one of the biggest indicators, where it was impossible to find a place to live. And so I ended up living in a flop house for a couple months, where I had a mattress on a floor, sharing a room with 5 different guys, and a house that had up to 14 different people in it. And something that I became really kind of hyper aware of, because there are I was living with guys who are from Jamaica, a guy from Florida, a guy who'd flown down from Alaska, somebody from Connecticut. Like, you start to see the forces at work. And because you're out there, being out in North Dakota on an oil rig and looking around, you're kind of like, how did I end up here? Is a feeling that I connected with. And you start to talk to other people, and you feel these huge forces at work, and their pressure that they put on people that put them into certain situations.
Yeah. When I was doing Dreamland, the Dreamland story I began focuses on a town in Mexico where everybody from this little town comes north to sell heroin, black tar heroin, like pizza delivery, right? So you have these little cells or crews settle in a town, and they'll have an operator, and they'll have 2 or 3 drivers who will drive around with their mouths full of little balloons of heroin and ready to swig them down if the cops stop them, and ready to take, most of the time, orders from the operator. And this system appealed especially to young men from the small rural towns who were not Scarface. You know, they didn't want to be cartel killers and that kind of stuff that you've seen on TV. They wanted to buy a new used truck, wanted to have some land, wanted to then therefore convince a girl that it was a good idea to marry them. And I went down to this village in Mexico, and for their annual fiesta. And really what it turns out to be is an enormous like convention of small-time heroin traffickers, right? All these guys coming back, and they go to the United States with this idea of coming back the king. It's like this motivation is really like when you go to your high school reunion. You don't want to go to your high school reunion, you know, divorced and on parole. You know what I mean? You want to go the big guy, the big shot, and all that kind of stuff. And so they come back, and one of the big things that they loved was Levi's 501s, and addicts would trade them 501s for dope, and they'd come back with big stacks of the stuff and give them away, and people walk around and but the amazing thing was when I was down there was that by the time I was down there, this business had evolved enough, and they were in enough cities. They were in Lexington, they were in Louisville, they were in Cincinnati, they were in Charlotte, Columbus, and Indianapolis, as well as many cities out west. And it had evolved to the place where they were making some very serious money. And so all these guys had the ability now to show, they all wanted to show that they had money, but it was a big deal to do that. And it got more expensive every year to do that because everyone would just up each other's game, you know. And so when I was out there, everybody was hiring bandas. And a banda is like a 15-piece band playing marching band instruments, snare drums, tubas, clarinets, playing dance music. Okay? It is really loud when you listen to a banda, one banda. But in the plaza, the night I was, the 3 nights I was there, the plaza was packed with all these different guys hiring their own banda, and every banda playing a different song for the little trafficker. And it was like free jazz. It was like, you know, levitates the hair on your head. You know, you just kind of, and you would see these guys. I have pictures of this one guy who had hired a banda. He had a 6-pack of beer hanging with the plastic rings as he danced to the banda with his girlfriend. So everybody saw him dancing to the banda. But that was only one of the, and of course the bandas just like came to town because they knew it was going to be major. It was like an enormous heroin convention, you know. And it's kind of like the same kind of idea. People flock to that you were talking about. It's like this idea, like this is my chance.
Right.
You know?
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and that's very much a big part of the whole of Boomtowns, I think, is that people go there. The idea is almost, you know, there's the resource that's extracted. So there's the oil or the natural gas that's in the ground or the coal, you know, in this part of the world. And then there's the people that go there to extract money from the companies. So you're sort of like your labor is being extracted in one way, but you're attempting to extract enough cash so that you can do exactly what you're describing, that these guys, you can buy the bigger truck, you can go back home and you can kind of peacock around. I feel like the banda thing is almost like such a great metaphor for the insane chaos inside these people's lives, you know?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is these guys would go with this idea that they didn't really understand heroin too well. I mean, they knew what it kind of what it was, but nobody really knew what it was, you know. And they would go and then, you know, they'd hear from their brothers-in-law or their friends, you know, this is how we do the job. And and you know, up in America, you sell in small amounts, and that they were made sure all the time, never have more on you more than like the certain quantity, never have a gun. Never have a gun. And so if you get caught, they'll kick you back to Mexico and we'll bring you back with another name. And these crews were all over the United. They were in like 20 states by then. And then people began to figure it out, you know, and they began to go do it. And it became a rite of passage almost for an entire generation. Like you couldn't really convince a girl that you were worthy unless you were coming back. And you also could start an entire migration almost single-handedly. One guy told me he went to kindergarten with a guy who went up to sell heroin in this way. Comes back. This guy comes back. He was one of the first in the even smaller village that's right next door to nearby this town that I'm writing about. And over a 2 or 3 year period, this guy puts up a house, and he builds a house, and then he builds the first automatic garage door in the town. And not the entire town, but a lot of people in the town would just stand out in front of that door, watching it go up and down. And the old people were like, whoa, look at that. That's so cool, man. Oh, that's, And after that, he said, all my friends, we all wanted to go north because we could. The other thing that would happen is when I was in Mexico, I lived in Mexico for 10 years, well before this book that Dreamland book I wrote. The key thing when you go to immigrant villages, I went to dozens of immigrant villages in different states, in Zacatecas, and Michoacan, and Oaxaca, and in Guanajuato, et cetera, all these different places. Everywhere you go, the one common denominator in all the immigrant villages is, well, actually two, but let's call it the same thing. First of all, new houses, because all these folks have brought back money and used cheap Mexican labor themselves to build these houses, promising that they will return. And the main promise is shown in the fact that out of the roofs are sticking rebar, like electric hair stuck way up, And that is a way of saying, I'm coming back for good, and I'm going to finish this house, and I'm going to live here. I don't really want to be up there, the gringos. I just want to make my money and come back. I'm Mexican and this kind of thing. And so every immigrant village I ever went to, you could count on rebar sticking out of the first floor of the roof of these houses. Until I went to this little town called Jalisco that we're talking about right now. It was the only town I ever been to where people would go to the United States a lot, and there was no rebar. And that's because heroin, the appeal of this was that heroin allowed you to build a house in 9 months or maybe 18 months instead of 9 years or 10 years, and maybe not even finish it even then. Heroin was this great equalizer too. So if you, as a poor country kid, would go into the butcher, guys would tell me this, go in with my mom, and the butcher would be abrupt and curt to my mother because he knew she was going to ask for credit. What do you want, senora? What, that kind of thing. And then he comes back. This one guy told me this very vividly. He says, I came back. He made a ton of money, $15,000 more than he ever made in his life. Takes a bus down from Phoenix, his hand entirely in his pocket the entire time holding his $15,000 in his new Levi's 501 jeans with these big old cowboy hat he just bought and a big old belt buckle. And he gets to town, and one of the first things he does is he hires the banda all night long for $3,000. He spent $3,000, he and a buddy, and they only stopped because the church was going to start mass the next day, that morning. It stopped went all night. But the other thing he told me was, we went into the butcher shop, and all of a sudden the butcher is, "Sí, señora, what can I do for you? How can I help you?" It was like this social equalizer, this kind of money. When you go back home, all of a sudden everyone treats you like, with respect,
right,
and without being
right.
to your mom in front of you and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting how the idea of a peaceful drug trade is kind of what pulled them up there too. The idea you can do it like delivering pizzas.
Right.
And something that I was surprised with in the oil patch was sort of, it seemed to me like the danger of the job was sort of written into the lifestyle and was a part of the pride that people took in it. So people were proud of the fact that they were working the hardest, worst job in the world. They're proud of the fact that you could get your head knocked off doing a job and that you'd go out at night and get drunk and get in fights. That kind of became its own kind of status symbol. What was interesting as I spent some time there, we were talking about the ACE tests. That's what it's called. was the amount of guys that I'd meet out there would, you'd sit down at a bar, somebody would say, what's your line of work? And then they'd say, man, my dad whipped my ass. And that would be often literally the first two things that you would talk about, with what you do for a living and how much your dad beat you up, and this kind of freewheeling, fun way. But it was a pattern that to me was like so surprising and so kind of like put me really off kilter, I think. And it's one of the reasons I resisted my book as a memoir. I resisted making it a memoir for a long time, but I kept getting, because I didn't want to talk about my dad whipping my ass. But I kept finding myself, I was writing about these other guys and their motivations for coming there. And I was like, well, I didn't come there for that. I came there for these other reasons. And I kept getting pushed a little bit more to delve into the personal reasons that maybe I would have ended up in this place. So.
Yeah, I find that as I traveled Mexico, one of the things that was always interesting to me, and this was huge and part of why people went north to sell heroin too, was that ability to come back and tell the stories. Mm-hmm. Like, I remember this one kid one time who was 16, never gone to the United States. All his life, all he had heard about in his town was guys coming back home and telling stories of what it was like. And of course, they leave out the bad stuff. Right. They leave out the fact that they had to wash dishes until 2 a.m, or they had to, pick tomatoes in the sun in the Central Valley, or something like that. They would tell stories of the big cars, the blonde-haired women.
Yeah.
And I remember him telling me, this is one of the first kids I ever met early on in my time in Mexico, and he was telling me, I don't want anybody to ever tell me about it anymore. I asked him why he was going to the United States. Why are you going to go? He goes, I just don't want people to tell me about it anymore. I just want to have my own stories,
right.
And in my second book, my second book about Mexico, I wrote a story about a kid named Delfino Juarez, who was from this little horrid village on the top of a mountain. It was rainy and it was just so poor and cold and everything. And this kid is the first to go to work in construction in Mexico City. Sometimes all these things take one person. It's like one person figures it out and everybody is like follows the chain. And this guy, Delfino, went at age 12. He was like 5 foot tall, takes a bus all by himself into Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world, and to work construction because he knows some campesinos from his town work there. And, and after a while, he was there a couple of years and he decides, of course, he's kind of enamored with the big city. He cuts his hair in a big punk mohawk. Each week, he's sending money home, and he's sniffing glue and all this kind of working his butt off. And then on the Saturday and the Sunday, he's getting crazy. But he's still sending his money home. But meanwhile, he hasn't been home yet, and he cuts his hair in a big mohawk. Really into kind of like the urban rock culture in Mexico City at the time. It was very punk oriented. Gets himself a nice dog collar with studs sticking out, a leather jacket. And it's at that moment that he decides to go home to his little village of rural people up in the middle of on the side of a mountain for the first time. And everyone who was there then, I talked to them all later, and they're all like, nobody forgot that moment. It was like this kid comes out like a Martian, comes out of another planet, and all the men were throwing rocks at him, what a disgusting guy, this kind of thing. And the women, his mother broke down in tears. Oh, my fruit is rotten, is what she said. Oh my God, he's crying and this kind of thing. But here's the thing, man. All the kids who were his age thought, I talked to all of them, they thought he was the coolest thing ever.
Shit ever.
They loved it. It was like this reason for leaving and this new way of testing yourself. Mm-hmm. You had to go to Mexico City, and you really had to go alone or not with your dad, basically. Right. And his dad was a drunk and was really not too much in the picture. And so he had to go on his own to support his family at 12.
Right.
And so when he leaves, but it's this interesting thing. I've always thought that you find these people that they're the pioneers. They have the greatest amount of gumption.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else kind of follows.
Right. And it becomes almost, there's like a rite of passage aspect in those communities. And it's interesting how much the stories play into the stories that you're hearing. And another thing that surprised me about my time in North Dakota was how there was some immigrant culture, but also how much of a migrant culture still exists in the United States. Because I met a lot of guys who had gone up and they would work the silver mines in Elko, Nevada, for instance. And then depending on the fluctuations in the price of silver, they'd make a little bit of money, kind of bottom out, and then they'd move to a place like Williston where they'd work the rigs for a certain amount of time. When that started to go down, they'd head down to Texas. And it's just interesting, these how big of a population that is right within the United States.
Kind of migrant workers, but in recovery and extraction.
Yeah, definitely. So, having ties back to sort of how you think of the Dust Bowl, and how you think of people who come into this country. There's also a good number of Congolese workers who I met,
of course,
who were working in the train yard for this company that I worked with. So we'd spend time on days that oil rigs weren't moving. We would hang out on this train yard and we'd unload pipe and casing. And there are a lot of Congolese guys that work there. Yeah. And my heart went out to them. It was really like some of them had lived in refugee camps in the Congo, had spent all this time and this effort and years and years and years to come to the United States of America. And they come to the United States of America and it's Williston, North Dakota. It's negative 30 degrees. There's nothing to do. There's as far as the culture went, kind of the oil had sucked the culture out of the town. There wasn't much music. There weren't plays. You couldn't keep people in the town because the prices got higher and higher and higher in the town. And so they couldn't keep teachers in the schools. So they were extracurricular school activities were basically impossible. And you just, and the idea of coming from the Congo and being like, finally, I'm coming to America, the land of, roses and oranges and all this other stuff. And you end up in North Dakota.
It's interesting. It's so fascinating. They're like, because there's a similar phenomenon that takes place in immigrant Mexico. The idea is people leave these villages because they want to better their lives, and the idea is to improve their lives back home.
Right.
The idea being that at some point people would then stop leaving the town, right? Because presumably get better and that kind of thing. What actually happens is the opposite. The folks who go north inflate the prices of everything back home. So they come back with dollars and they come back with stories. And those two things are enough to keep everybody going. So once one person leaves, pretty soon everybody has to leave, because nobody, first of all, can afford the price of milk anymore, can afford to buy a cow, can afford the price of barbed wire. Right. Can afford certainly a new car. That's completely out of, as is a new house. So as the level rises, and it does rise, the town actually empties out. And so you go to these towns where it's absolutely, it's like a movie set, where it looks beautiful and nobody lives there anymore. Yeah, I've walked through many towns where you can hear the rooster crow at the other end of the village. It's that quiet. Or you can hear one, and it's usually made up of women, married women, their young kids who are children of the guys who are up north, and people who are very old and handicapped people. And then a merchant class that is very thin, that runs like a few stores and that kind of thing. But it's a remarkable thing. So once one person goes, eventually everybody has to go. First of all, the boys don't dare not go, because they're viewed as like less manly, or they have not really, that rite of passage thing is really big in Mexico with immigration. Certainly when I was down there, and had been for many, many years, but the prices are all inflated. So if you don't have somebody who's connected to dollars, you really have a very difficult time living there, affording almost anything. Soon the food is too expensive.
Yeah.
The milk, again, the barbed wire stuff that you would use around your little plot of land, all of that becomes way too expensive. And then that means people have to leave, as well as the whole attraction of being, the kids want to be a man. Basically, a guy told me, we're just really, a school teacher there told me one time, we're just really training these kids, trying to educate these kids till they get to be 16. They know they're never going to go to college because they earn more than someone who's gone to college in Mexico.
Yeah, so something that I found in the stories of people who I kept up with after the oil boom was that, you could, even those who were able to make a lot of money working on oil rigs, of which I was not one of them. It didn't work out that way for me, and it didn't work out that way for most of the people that I know. But the people who were able to make some money and go back to home, they would go home and they would say, okay, I have X amount of thousands of dollars or whatever, because the boom is basically ended. And, the money goes away. There still aren't jobs in these other small towns in America where people are coming from when they go to work in the oil field. So they go back, and then you're sort of, okay, you have a little bit of money. You can maybe make an improvement to your house. You can do a few things, but then you're sort of right back there, and your options are basically minimum wage jobs.
Right.
Sort of
That's what happened in the heroin
jobs.
village I was writing about, where people would go north. They would have this idea, well, I'm going to come back and buy land, or I'm coming back and buy a taxi cab or buy a bakery or something like that. They would go north. They'd work for 9 months to 18 months selling heroin here in Lexington, Cincinnati, whatever it was. And they'd come back and they'd be sending money back to mom, and they'd have a lot of money back home. And they'd come back, but they couldn't not spend it. Right. So they had to spend it on the bond. And otherwise people would think badly of them. And so their money, they were like king for 6 weeks to 3 months.
Right.
And when that happened, then there's no other way to make that kind of money again. Right. Except to go back and sell heroin.
Well, and I can imagine too that even in a sort of safer drug dealer zone, so being a drug dealer, kind of like a pizza delivery guy, you're still super stressed out. And you're still in a different country where you can get in a lot of trouble for being, and you're still going to be you're just going to be tense and kind of on edge all the time.
Right.
And what I found in having done, when I did the oil field work, and what I found with other people, is it was so hard after doing that job and after being in that headspace. It was so hard to wind down. So I would, make fun of the guys who were buying big trucks and doing all these kind of blowing their money whenever they could, and then would find myself thinking of myself as a pretty smart guy. I would fly back to New York on a vacation and end up just eating at every restaurant I could, and kind of just like being up all night, like paying
for the banda.
Everybody, paying for the banda, and just knowing I was stupid, but just not even. Thinking about it wasn't much of a thing. I want to change gears because I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
Because I hear about fentanyl.
Oh, right.
And I hear about people dying from it. But I don't understand what it is and why people would put it in drugs. Because for me, it has always seemed when I hear about it, I think, well, that's not a very good business decision to kill your customer.
Right. Do we have some time to? Oh, okay, fine. I saw you there, and I thought, maybe he's going to cut us off here. But okay, yeah, this is happening across the country now. Fentanyl is, and it has to do with the ease, the enormous supply that they're able to make down in Mexico. So it's no longer land. You make the drugs with chemicals, and if you have access to ports, you can get really as many chemicals as the port will allow. Well, they control those 2 ports, and so the chemicals are flowing in, and so they're able to make really just very colossal, just staggering quantities.
So what you mean by, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but so what you mean by synthetic drugs is that
drugs are made with chemicals.
So they're right. You don't have to grow anything to make fentanyl.
No. You make fentanyl with a series of chemicals that they frequently buy, mostly really from China.
Okay.
But you can
And
buy
it's
them
easy
anywhere.
enough, and it's easy enough for
And it's
anybody
easy.
to
Now
kind
they've
of,
learned it. Yeah, they didn't initially. Fentanyl was first from China, but then Chinese government cracked down. The Mexicans learned how to make it, and the
Right.
enormous quantities we've been seeing in the last few years have all because of that. Now, why then would you want, as a dealer, to put it into other things? Why would you want to sell something like? Well, there's some very, we'll call them good, with quotation marks, good business reasons why you might want to do that. One is that if you add fentanyl to cocaine or methamphetamine, these are drugs that people buy very occasionally, every weekend or something, 3 or 4 days. You very quickly will have, adding fentanyl to it, you very quickly will have an opioid addict. Fentanyl is an opioid, just like oxycodone, just like heroin, hits the opioid receptors in our brain, and you will very quickly get an opioid addict who has to buy your product every single day to keep the sickness away. So you do it to expand your customer base, or at least the repeat customers, from being, customers who buy every once in a while to customers who buy every single day. And that's what's happening across America. Now you're finding people who started out not knowing what they had, what they were buying.
Right.
Cocaine with some fentanyl, okay, to people who now have to have fentanyl. They can't. They are fentanyl addicts.
Okay, so it's much more highly addictive than
Highly
cocaine.
addictive and much more potent. And of course, and once you do that, so what we're seeing now is that fentanyl, there's very little heroin anymore on the streets of America. That's going to be crowded out. Within a few more years, you really won't see like any. I was in East Tennessee a couple of weeks ago, and a guy says, "We're buying this stuff. We call it heroin. They still call it heroin. There's no heroin in it. He says there's probably everything but heroin in it." The other thing is that I think is important in all this is that when one of your customers dies, it's not necessarily the worst thing, because in the drug addicted world, this is a measure of how powerful is the control that these drugs exercise on our brains. That when a guy sells a dose and that dose overdoses or kills somebody, that is not a warning, it's an advertisement. It's like, go get that dope. And the drug addicted world, now we would not do that, but folks who have their brains kind of hijacked and brainwashed by dope, particularly this very potent stuff, that's exactly what happens. The first time that they ever saw a big fentanyl outbreak, really out of Mexico, was in Chicago and Detroit. And they put up warning signs. The officials in town put up warning signs, say, "Watch out, this is bad stuff." People flocked to the housing projects where they're selling it because that very reason. Even though people were dying in droves. Yeah.
In your opinion, if OxyContin had never been invented, how would the state of addiction be different?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I really believe that what led to OxyContin two things led to where we are today. One is the change in our historic change in our heroin markets. Now, you look about the same age as me. I'm 62. I don't know. I remember growing up in the 70s. What do we know about heroin? It was from French Connection, Serpico. There's great movies out of New York. Why New York? Because all the dope would come from the Far East, Turkey, Burma, and they come across continent. Exactly. Right. All of that stuff, precisely. And it would get here expensive. It come to New York, and then it come out to the rest of the country. It get here expensive and very weak, right? And then the Mexican trafficking world and the Colombians began to move their heroin up in the 80s. And by the early 1990s, we don't see any more Far Eastern heroin in this country anymore. They cannot compete with the heroin coming up from so close by, okay? And so that was the situation when the opioid promotion of opioids began in the medical community across this country, and pain is the fifth vital sign, and the pain should be treated aggressively, and There was a certain situation before OxyContin. People would mess around with low-dose Vicodin, Percocets, but those all had acetaminophen in them, and so you would really do a lot of damage to your inner organs and so on if you use that stuff too much. Some people did, They didn't care. That happened, sure. But, and of course, as more of these prescribing happened, more people opted for that route. But OxyContin came out, it had no acetaminophen, no abuse deterrent for the first 15 years of its life. And so it had these very large doses of a very potent opioid. And so it took people up to very high doses, daily doses, like 200 milligrams a day, 300 milligrams a day. You lose your insurance, you have to go to the street to buy your pills. Maybe that happens, Well, that's $1 a milligram for each of those pills. So 80, you're spending $200, $300 a day. You cannot. And it's at that point that people begin to discover the cheap Mexican heroin that has been around for a while, but didn't have a market until we began to create this. I don't think we'd ever have had the same opioid problem, or I'm sorry, heroin problem, had, first of all, the historic change in our markets not occurred. Had it just been that very weak and very expensive stuff coming out of the Far East, by the time it gets to Cleveland or wherever, it's really very, very low quality stuff. But then also, I don't believe we'd have had the same problem without OxyContin. OxyContin takes people up to a very high dose, and a lot of times the doctor freaks out and goes, "What am I done? You can't have any more. No, we're cutting you off." Or they lose their insurance. That's another thing that happens. And then people just go to the street where they find this. If it hadn't been for the very, very low price, high potency heroin coming out of Mexico, we wouldn't have had people switching so easily, it seems to me. And that's kind of OxyContin's role. The Sackler family is correct in saying that really OxyContin was not a majority of what people were using around the country. That's true. There was other opioids that were far more popular and so on, but it did have a crucial role. And of course, it benefited by the fact that the Purdue Pharma sales techniques were very, very aggressive and very well paid and very motivated, and the sales force. So that's a whole other story, of course.
Are we moving to a Q&A thing?
Questions.
There we go.
Did you find that the Mexicans had any type of competitive advantage from their discipline about? You mentioned that they wouldn't carry a gun. Did that extend to also not using the drugs?
Yeah, but I don't think it had so much to do with. It had to do with discipline. But the idea was very clear to people that if you're an illegal immigrant selling quarter grams in balloons of heroin in Portland was a good example. Portland was the first base that they adopted after they moved they started this whole system started from this village of people living in San Fernando Valley of LA. So the first place they go after that is Portland. And in Portland, they have this idea, well, we shouldn't be arresting people for small quantities and this kind of thing, and we don't have room in the jail anyway. And so they begin to let people go, or they cite and release. And of course, these guys are never going to go for any court date and come back for any court date and that kind of thing. And even if they're arrested, frequently they're just deported unless they have a gun. And if they have a gun, all of a sudden it's like 10 years, because you're illegally in the country. Now you got a gun, and some dope. And so that's 10 years in prison. So it didn't require too much discipline for people to see that was really not a good idea. I would say that the main thing that kept them from using heroin was that heroin is viewed as an even scuzzier drug than we view it in this country. I mean, it's so low class. And this was a time when a lot of the trafficking world was selling lots of cocaine. Cocaine's a high class drug, or of course, alcohol. And of course, a lot of times what they really were addicted to what they really were enamored with was how they looked, boots, really nice boots, nice car. A big thing they invested in rather than that was horses. I saw a parade of horses that I was told, had it been there 20 years ago, was just a bunch of old nags. Every year at this fiesta, they have a big parade of horses. And I was walking along with one guy asking him, an older fella, like, tell me how much this, the horse is $20,000 horse. This saddle, $5,000. This is what he was quoting to me: $5,000 saddle. This is not a bunch of old nags. And so a lot of the money, there was never that impulse to use it to get particularly like, high in the same sense. It's more of an idea of wanting to show how big you are, what a king you are, and so and if you ask me, that's really the impulse of every immigrant. It's as it is to all of us when we go to our high school reunion. Again, you don't want to go on parole and divorced, right? You want to go in a nice car, beautiful wife, on a, that kind of thing is the kind of the typical impulse. Very much like that from all of immigrant Mexico, and that is really what in my opinion, fuels a lot of the drug trade in Mexico. It's higher risk, much higher reward. You can be kind of the king, the way an immigrant who works in construction or restaurants here in the United States and goes back home never can be. And so it's as much a way of elevating your own social standing, and particularly among those people who may at one point in your life have treated you humiliated you, like the way they did with your mom in front of the butcher shop before the guy had lots of money and that kind of thing. It's this big thing like that. And so a lot of it is really about what you imagine yourself doing with that money when you leave for the first time. And getting high on heroin is like not even on the list. And of course, going to prison for 10 years for a gun is also.
Do you think they consider themselves good Catholics?
Many of them are not. They're Catholic in name. I would say that what happens is a lot of them. One guy told me this. I asked him this question: Do you know what you're selling? Do you know the damage that it's doing to people? And he said, here's the thing. Yeah, my mom hates this stuff. My mom won't allow us to talk about it around the house. All of his brothers and most of his brothers-in-law are doing this business. So it's a family of maybe 8 or 10 men in the United States doing this business. A few of them whom, like him, have done time in prison. It's a guy I got to know fairly well. And he said, but here's the thing. When it's like a Sunday dinner or something like that, and we show up with all this food, my mom like looks the other way. When you're in poverty all your life, and all of a sudden you're not, the money assuages a lot of moral qualms. You know what I mean? And the other thing is that a lot of these guys don't really understand, even though they're in the car with these addicts to make the exchange. The system works. So you're looking for dope. You call this number that's circulated all across through the addict world in your town, and you say, I need 5 hits. They send a driver and he spits out the 5 doses, boom, boom, boom. And you're in the car with the guy 15 seconds. They don't speak English at all, except for to say, no credit, 20 minutes, $15, these basic things. And so it's like you have no personal connection, to the folks that you're dealing with. And I think that's a big reason why fentanyl is also such a big deal. People can make a lot of money on that stuff down in Mexico, and they don't care or think too much about how utterly deadly this stuff can be and how it's damaging so many people. I think the same is very true with methamphetamine, which is now driving people mad very quickly and homeless very quickly. No one thinks about that kind of stuff because it's just money and keeping up with the Joneses or the Gomezes or whatever.
Yeah, Michael, Stan had mentioned that in the Mexican immigrant communities, he would see like one man go and find a job that works really well, and so then everyone else from the community would go do the same thing. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you noticed in the oil rig community as well, where there were a bunch of men from one hometown, for example?
That's interesting. I think that there was definitely some of that, and there were definitely, brothers. An older brother would come and would do the job for a while, and I think at the time, at the specific time that I was there, had the boom had kind of started to pop right after the housing crash, and so it was a perfect storm with all the housing and construction guys, roofers, carpenters. All these people were suddenly completely out of work, and so I think that it just I'm not sure how much it translated to that exactly, but I do think that it was this kind of, people were there because of the economic, they needed to be there, and another result of that was the town that we were in was, people loved disrespecting the town, so this place is a shithole, there's nothing to do. It was all about how terrible the town was, and they can't wait to get back to Iowa, to where they grew up, where the girls are pretty and and the mountains are beautiful, and so you'd hear that a lot, which caused also a lot of conflict with locals, because the locals had the opposite feeling. They said, well, this used to be a really beautiful community. You'd walk down the street, you'd know everybody at the Walmart, you'd have a drink and your friends would be there, and people wouldn't be harassing your wife when she was walking around. And so that created a lot of real conflict between outsiders and insiders, to the extent that one insult that you would hear the locals levy against people would be an Idahoan water hauler was considered a sort of mean thing to say to someone, because the water haulers, the truck drivers who would haul water, were often the very new truck drivers. They'd never driven a rig before, and you'd see them sort of swerving around the road. And the idea that they came to from Idaho was somehow even a greater insult. But so, factionalism and this real intense factionalism. From, you'd talk to a guy who would talk about people from Minnesota, really, really that level. Well, those sons of bitches from Minnesota, they don't know how to work. They don't know how to do this stuff. We hired this guy from Minnesota. He's coming over here and telling, and it's just like, I'm like,
I always hated Minnesota.
I was like, you guys are exactly the same person.
I hate those guys.
Yeah. So it was a funny, funny, not funny.
I would say one of the things that's interesting about the question you ask is, in Mexico, there is really part of the reason for the intense chain phenomenon is that in Mexico, there's not a way for a poor campesino's son to go to college and become a mechanical engineer or a lawyer or a doctor. It's always so that's why you learn your job from the people around you. That's why you find all these villages where everybody does the same job. A lot of times it's everybody migrates to Indianapolis and works in construction, that kind of thing. But you find this in my first book. I wrote a story about a town where everybody makes popsicles. And the popsicle story is a magnificent story. It's all across Mexico. They've started these popsicle shops all across Mexico. It's actually a wonderful mechanism through which a lot of people have gone from poor rural poverty to the middle class without leaving Mexico, without selling drugs. There's another whole constellation of towns, but one in particular where literally everybody is a pimp. Everybody's pimping girls, conniving, getting girls to work for them and this kind of thing. Rural, kind of innocent girls who don't know what they're doing. But the idea is that in Mexico, there isn't that access to education that is a great equalizer. And so you find everybody in this town of a certain class, and that's a very big part of the town, the young men, that entire generation, I want to say from like the early 90s to 2015 or more, virtually all the guys, if that class, at some point went north to sell heroin in this way. Because of that, you don't find it as much, I don't think. Maybe in some areas you do, but in mostly in America, you don't find it that much.
So like essentially no opportunity to explore other interests.
None, and that's why it's a bizarre thing. But I was finding this all the time, everywhere you go. I found an entire town where everybody learned to hire themselves out as police officers in other places. An entire town where everybody started tortilla shops, right? You see this all the time. And of course, the big thing is immigration. You see this in LA. I did a story about an entire necklace of towns around the capital city of Durango, state of Durango. Everybody was a landscaper in LA, and strangely enough, for reasons I never quite understood, they all played volleyball on Tuesday. But all these different guys from these villages would all get together after work and play volleyball on Tuesday. I showed up one time, they thought I was like the DEA or something, that kind of thing.
Like,
but it's that idea that there is no opportunity without finding, you learn your opportunity from people around you.
right. Can we get a hand for our panelists, please? I mean, yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you guys very
Thanks,
much.
Mike.
Yeah,
Great.
thanks.
Terrific, man.
Yeah.
Good job.